Back to Fill Paper Roulette. This is episode 8, part 2. I am in awe of other streamers that do this all day. Granted, I'm talking a lot and not just playing games. That playing games takes effort too, but like I'm losing my mind. Granted, I've not used to speaking this much. I'm just like hyperventilating. I might have the audio working now. I have no idea. It seems a little wonky. Anywho, we've been going over Imagination and the Distinction Between Image and Intuition in Kant by R. Brian Tracz. This is forthcoming in Ergo. It was just posted online right today. So, if I recall correctly from like whatever it was 15 minutes ago, I have no idea actually. Basically, the thesis is that from what we get from our intuition and what we output through our concepts or understand through our concepts in Kant is there's a intermediary step, and that's what the author is calling image. That somehow the intuition gets crafted into this image, and then the image is then what the concept sort of interprets. It's not quite that we get directly from like empirical intuition, and that's what the concepts understand the world through. But this image is a sort of like not quite empirical, not quite conceptual, sort of intermediate step. So, we are now up to part 3, images and pure intuition. Even if images are fundamentally distinct from empirical intuitions, the distinctness thesis might still be false, for Kant might be committed to the claim that pure intuitions are images. What's pure mean then? In this section, I contend that the pure intuition of space described in the metaphysical expositions and the transcendental aesthetic, the pure representation of infinite given magnitude with a whole prior to part structure, is not an image. Nevertheless, Kant does recognize a central role for an imagistic representation of space, but I suggest that this pure image of space is fundamentally distinct from and depends on the pure intuition of space. It is well known that Kant discusses pure intuitions of space and time at length, particularly in the transcendental aesthetic, the crucial first division of the critique. Less well known is that Kant does indeed speak of pure images in the schematism of the first critique. He writes that the pure image of all magnitudes, quantorum, for outer sense is space, and for all objects of the senses in general it is time. Though some interpreters have explicitly equated pure images and pure intuitions, I think there are at least 3 reasons that Kant meant to consider them fundamentally distinct. First, some have argued, to my mind convincingly, that the understanding due to its discursive nature could not in principle produce the pure intuition of space. We can adapt this argument about discursivity into an argument about the nature of image production. Consider the processes of apprehension and reproduction on which images production depend. According to Kant, apprehension is successive and goes from part to whole, but Kant's claim about the pure intuition of space seems to be just the opposite. We are given space all at once, and the single all-encompassing and essentially single space is prior to its parts. Image production depends on part before whole apprehension, whereas the pure intuition of space is a whole before part representation. As a result, our pure intuition of space cannot itself be an image. It cannot be an output of an image production. Yeah, I believe things like this got mentioned above in the previous part to this episode. Yeah, there's a reduction going on in the image production. A second reason to distinguish the pure image of space from the pure intuition of space is that images and pure intuitions are grounded in different faculties of the mind. In his response to Eberhard, Kant provides a crucial correction to Eberhard's conception of pure intuition. Or have I ever called the intuitions of space and time, in which images are first of all possible, themselves images which will always presuppose a concept of which they are the exhibition, that is, the indeterminate image for the concept of a triangle, wherein neither the ratios of sides nor those of the angles are given. Yeah, where have I ever called intuitions of space and time? Images. Okay. The ground of the impossible is a rhetorical question here. Just a lot of stuff in between. The ground of the possibility of sensory intuitions is neither of the two, neither limit of the cognitive faculty nor image. It is the mere receptivity peculiar to the mind when it is affected by something in sensation to receive representation in accordance with its subjective constitution. Kant denies in this passage that our intuitions of space and time are themselves images. He explains that it is sensibility and its mere receptivity that is the ground of these intuitions of space and time. Kant emphasizes this point in one of his essays. What is subjective in the formal constitution of sense, as receptivity for the intuition of an object, is alone that which makes possible a priori, that is, in advance of all perception and a priori intuition. Kant suggests in both these passages that sensibility in its non-spontaneous guise, as sense from mere receptivity, grounds the features of the pure intuitions of space. Yet, as we saw above, the imagination implicates the active, not merely receptive facets of sensibility, including the synthesis of imagination in his productive guide. And if Kant intended for image production to explain how essential features of pure intuition of space and time arise, then it is unclear why he chose to emphasize the mere receptive aspects of sensibility in these passages. After all, for Kant, the senses cannot produce images, and the features of images depend on the activities of the imagination that go above and beyond the senses. So the pure image of space is grounded on different faculties and mental activities from the pure intuition of space. Yeah. As anticipated in the previous passage, a third reason to distinguish the pure image of space from the pure intuition of space is that pure intuitions ground images. So we got a grounding relation here. Again, in reference to Eberhard, Kant considers and rejects the view that space as a whole is an image of the same kind as an image of a triangle. So image of the space as a whole. Yeah, so again, you have to sort of reduce things. For Eberhard understands by imagistic not something like the figure in space as geometry would view it, but space itself. That's the whole thing. Although it's hard to understand how one could form an image of something external to oneself without presupposing space. Yeah, see again, if you're going to talk about the entire world, then the only representation of the world is the world. So how could one form an image of something external to oneself without presupposing space external to yourself? It's hard to talk about the whole world without just saying the whole world. Otherwise you're talking about some part of the world in some way. This passage implies that the pure intuition of space is not an image of something external to oneself, for images of outer objects presuppose space. Yeah, they have some outer presupposition that you can't reduce. So to have an image of something external to oneself, one must already possess a pure intuition of space. Okay. These three considerations, there's definitely an issue here. I don't know about pure intuition of space, that's Kantian lingo, but the point is well made. These three considerations suggest that the pure image of space is fundamentally distinct from the pure intuition of space. The pure image of space is distinct from intuition of space. Now, one might suspect that Kant was being imprecise in his mention of a pure image in the schematism. On the contrary, I think that there is a way of seeing the distinct pure image of space as a unique cog in the machinery of schematism, which I will only sketch here. In his essay on Kastner's treatises, Kant distinguishes two representations of space in a way that I think directly maps onto the distinction I propose between a pure intuition and pure image. He claims that metaphysics shows how one can have the original representation of space, whereas geometry teaches how one can describe a space. Okay, have the original representation, whereas one describe it. So we've got to have and describe. In metaphysics, one considers how space is given as an original space, whereas in geometry, one considers how space is made or derived from this originally given space. Kant then consolidates the distinction between metaphysical and geometrical doctrines of space by drawing distinction between two different representations of space, which he calls subjective given space and objectively given space. For Kant, the metaphysically, i.e. original, nonetheless merely subjectively given space consists in the pure form of the sensible mode of representation of the subject as a priori intuition. So subjectively given space is itself a representation that is a pure a priori intuition. So just the world given is that. Thus, Kant makes a distinction between metaphysical or subjectively given space and geometrical or objectively given space. Now, my suggestion is that subjectively given space is a non-imagistic representation of space, whereas objectively given space is an imagistic representation of space. The pure image of space, objectively given space, is a representation of space produced on the basis of the pure intuition of space, subjectively given space. If objectively given space is equated with the pure image of space, then it is not surprising that geometrically an objective given space is always finite. Yeah, again, the smaller thing must be in the image. For images are produced by successive apprehension and reproduction procedures which are themselves finite activities. Again, reducing in some way. So this does make some sense. The imagination cannot apprehend an infinite quantity of items. Yeah, so it's you're definitely, the idea is in some sense you're sort of making a sieve. It's a straining the sort of like real world, so you're getting a more manageable set of things to deal with. It's a filter. Our imagistic representation of space represents a finite space, whereas our non-imagistic representation of space represents infinite space. This observation blocks the possibility that the pure intuition of space becomes the pure image of space, since the pure intuition of space does not become finite, it remains infinite. Excuse me. Though a full account of the pure image of space would need to take into account Kant's understanding of geometric construction, we at least have the resources to make sense of why Kant invokes the pure images of space and time in the schematism. The topic of the schematism is the subsumption of an object under a concept. Recall too that a schema is a representation of a general procedure of the imagination for providing a concept with its image. So Kant's thought is that in order for a spatial object to be subsumed under concepts, the imagination must produce an imagistic objectively given representation of space. For instance, if I place three lines mutually orthogonal to one another in space, then I am carving space into three distinct dimensions. This is a pure image of space with canonical compositionality. The pure image explicitly represents three-dimensional, not two, or four-dimensional space. So the subsumption requires that the imagination produce objectively given space, and this product relies on the pure intuition of space or subjectively given space. Okay, so if you're gonna give a a representation of like this, and then we got something going like we got this one here, and so we got different orthogonal lines that represents a space, but of course the lines themselves do not represent all the space, they just do some of the space, and specifically it's a reduction, well, you can say it's a simplification just to show that you've got dimensions here with using the lines. So fair enough. Okay, defending the no intuitions thesis. In the previous sections, I argued that Kant accepts the image thesis and the distinctness thesis. For him, the imagination produces images, and images are fundamentally distinct from both pure and empirical intuitions. We will now turn to the controversial no intuitions thesis, according to which the imagination does not produce intuitions of any kind. That is a little stronger, that's true. The no intuitions thesis is a natural complement to the image and distinctness thesis, for if the imagination produces images via apprehension and reproduction of intuitions, and if these images are not intuitions, then the imagination cannot also produce intuitions via the same process of apprehension and reproduction. Instead, the senses are natural candidates for the original producers of intuition. Kant does, after all, claim that it is the business of the senses to intuit, that of the understanding to think. Yeah, well, it's a strong claim that there's nothing in the mind that could also produce a sense, maybe. Nevertheless, there are some initially compelling reasons to think that the imagination produces intuitions or grounds their essential features. My goal in this section is to show that once we appreciate the image and distinctness thesis, many of Kant's central texts on the imagination admit of a reading that is compatible with the no intuitions thesis. Yeah, sure, I can see where this is going. Once you have this middle ground called image, then you can it's a cleaner version of stuff, and that way you can sort of force all the things that you might have thought the intuition would be giving you in terms of the imagination would be giving you in terms of intuition, that will all get shoved into what is an image. So okay, so it's sort of this is going to be a catch-all for maybe some of the uncomfortable parts of imagination. To take our first case, Kant maintains that the imagination is involved in memory and recollection of previous representations. As Kant puts it, the reproductive imagination can bring back into the mind an empirical intuition had previously. There are at least two different ways of carrying out the statement. On the first model, empirical intuitions are reproduced in the way that a copy machine copies an original paper. The copy is not itself the original empirical intuition. Perhaps all that is preserved from an image formed from the empirical intuition, not the empirical intuition itself. Like you can make a copy of a 3D object and you get a 2D thingy from it, and it's like a shadow. But you get some sort of representation. On the first model, an image of some copied representation figures into a state that allows us to remember the episode, perhaps accompanied by some various beliefs that link the image to a particular episode. On the second model, to reproduce an empirical intuition is to bring the same intuition back into mind, just as I reproduce it, the same non-counterfeit driver's license every time an airport agent asks for it. You're not going to an airport right now, you've got like coronavirus. On this view, the empirical intuition is stored, not a copy of it. Yeah, so you're just like reproducing the same thing. The key point is that neither view of memory requires that empirical intuition depend on the imagination for their production, even if their preservation or reproduction requires the imagination. If an empirical intuition could be preserved after its object is absent, this would not show that empirical intuitions or any of the features depend for their generation or production on the imagination. However, the case of mental imagery and hallucinations pose a special challenge to the no intuitions thesis. The objection goes like this. Suppose I imagine a dog with 3 horns. Why wouldn't you do 3 heads? I mean, you just have Cerberus. Alright, dog with 3 horns. Even though I'm not sensing and have never sensed a dog with 3 horns, I could similarly hallucinate this object. In these cases, the imagination actively recombines sensory qualities to represent an object I've never seen before. But here's the rub. So goes the objection. When I'm imagining a dog's brown body and its red horns, I am producing a new empirical intuition because my imagination is recombining red and blue sensations into a new spatial configuration. Moreover, Kant adds that the representation of such a dog in hallucination has the same quality in both truth and dream, such that we should deny that every intuitive representation entails the existence of an outer object. Yeah, so you could hallucinate stuff. But Kant's text on these points allow that an image as a mere effect of the imagination is the common element in veridical and non-veridical cases. As explained in section 2.2, the image itself would not involve sensation production in the way that empirical intuitions do, but instead would involve rearrangement of traces of previously produced sensations. Yeah, so you've got a schematization of dog and horns, you put them together. So it's not a new empirical thing, but you've got the sort of roadmap for building such stuff. Thus, in no Intuitions Thesis can make sense of Kant's suggestion that empirical intuitions would depend immediately on or presuppose the presence of an object, while allowing that some intuitive representations like images lack this dependence. For Kant does not think that images have the same dependence on present objects that empirical intuitions do. At the same time, there is qualitatively identical representations of the object and image that can be entertained in both veridical and non-veridical perception. Yeah. Pure representation, space, time, and exhibition. As I begin to argue in section 3, there are a variety of ways that Kant seems to deny imagination a substantive role in the production of pure intuitions of space and time. To repeat, Kant thinks that the formal constitution of sense, not the imagination, is alone that which makes it possible a priori, that is, in advance of all perception and a priori intuition. Similarly, in the transcendental aesthetic of the Critique, Kant denies that space and time are creatures of the powers of imagination, and Kant explains this claim by invoking images. If geometry merely described a creature of the imagination, then Kant thinks it is unclear how the things would have to agree necessarily with such an image that we form of them by ourselves and in advance. Good question, Kant. But Kant claims precisely for this our pure intuition of space, objects do not necessarily agree with the intuition of space that we form a priori to encountering these objects. No, objects do necessarily. I was thinking do not. I was like, wait, what? Okay, they necessarily agree with the intuition of space because, yeah. It's not like a coincidence that geometry works out the way it is. That's the whole point, that there's something out there. But, still, we're not making it up. If it was a creature of the imagination we're making it up, it would be amazing that geometry all worked out. Still, some of Kant's texts seem to stand in tension with the no Intuitions Thesis about the imagination. Kant does indeed claim that without apprehension by the imagination we could have a priori neither representations of space nor of time. Yet when Kant claims that the imagination is required for these purest and most fundamental representations of space-time, he does so in his argument for the claim that apprehension and reproduction are required for such representations. Since Kant claims the apprehension is directed at the intuition, it would be odd if these representations of space and time were themselves the pure intuitions of space and time. Kant's examples actually seem to tell against this identification. His examples of representation of time are a line, one noon to the next, and a certain number. These three representations are plausibly examples of images, therefore this passage does not spell trouble for the no Intuitions Thesis. Okay, yeah, so all the things that were problems are now getting shoved into the images category. Let's see. Yeah, we're going blah, blah, blah. Have I missed anything? It would be yeah, okay, no. It's fall back to the, it's a fallback to these image things, which aren't pure, which aren't empirical and aren't the result of the imagination, concepts of that are the result of the imagination. Kant also claims that space is an ens imaginarium. Let's stipulate that this passage is indeed meant to assert that space in some sense depends on the imagination. This claim comes in the final paragraph of the Transcendental Analytic, where Kant draws up a table of the concept of nothing, which is a species of the concept of an object in general. Okay. So more specifically, Kant seems to be saying that space considered as an object in general depends on the imagination. Yeah, okay. So we were getting to some sort of like heady stuff about like objects and being. There is evidence in this passage that space considered as an object refers to the pure image of space, not the pure intuition. When Kant unpacks his conception of ens imaginarium, he claims that space is an ens imaginarium because if extent beings were not perceived, one would not be able to represent space. The fact that Kant seems to be asserting that our ability to represent space depends on our perception of objects suggests that he's talking about an imagistic representation of space. Yeah. So, I mean, if he's forcing it into this image sort of concept is really, yeah. So it's sort of epistemic forcing where we're not going to talk about that other thing in the bad way because we can only talk about it in this good way. So that's what's really going on. For Kant insists that the non-imagistic pure intuition of space itself is not a perception, and that it does not depend on perception, but the image kind of does. So Kant must be referring to a space represented objectively and imagistically in the passage. This objective representation is plausibly the pure image of space, not the pure intuition of space. Okay, you see, this is sort of like where this whole argument's going. If once you get this sort of imagistic category, you can sort of, this is the cleanup spot where this is the part that doesn't seem to work very well. If you want to talk about space, you have to talk about space, the whole thing, in a smaller way. And so now that you've got this new concept, you can, this new category, let's say, of imagistic things, then you can talk about space imagistically because you can't talk about it in the big way because that is too big, because as we were discussed earlier. A similar response on behalf of the no intuitions thesis could be made regarding Kant's claim that the unity of a formal... got distracted for a sec, thought about something stupid I'd done. Could be made regarding Kant's claim that the unity of a formal intuition presupposes a synthesis. In this heavily contested passage, what? A unity of formal presupposes synthesis. Yeah, again, I've been saying reduction the whole day. What is a synthesis here? In this heavily contested passage, Kant is marking two ways that space is represented a priori, and he specifically claims that the unity of the formal intuition ultimately presupposes a synthesis, even though the form of intuition, which Kant himself calls pure intuition, does not presuppose such a synthesis. It is the formal intuition that involves space represented as an object, as is really required in geometry. Okay, yeah. So it says the sort of the smaller thing. In line with in section 3, Kant likely has in mind an objective representation of space involved in geometry that he associates with the imagination, synthesis, and image formation, and which contrasts with the subjective original pure intuition of space. Cool. Alright, that makes, I think that's well said. Now, it cannot be denied that Kant very closely associates pure intuition with the imagination, purely under its productive guise. Pure intuition of space and time belong to the productive faculty of imagination, but a proponent of the pure intuition of space and time belong to productive faculty of imagination. Okay, but a proponent of the no intuition thesis can point to a key elucidation, namely that the imagination is productive because it is a faculty of the original exhibition of the object, exhibitio originaria. Plausibly, exhibition is not merely a synonym for intuition of an object. Yeah, exhibition of an image, I guess he's going for here. Kant often confusingly associates the idea of giving an object both exhibition and intuition. See. Criticize Kant right here to support your thesis. I mean, maybe, I don't know, I'm not a Kant person. Intuition gives objects to the mind. In contrast, images in the imagination are involved in giving a corresponding intuition to the concept under the understanding. But this latter sense of giving an object to a concept instead of to the mind is a fundamentally distinct notion for Kant because, you're giving image here. Exhibition is this activity of giving an object to a concept, whereas intuition is the activity of giving an object to the mind. Yeah, because you've got this middle ground now. So you got one coming into the middle, and then the middle going to the mind. So you got world to exhibition is giving the object to a concept. So you've got intuition giving the object to the mind, and then that's the image thing and then that's giving the object to a concept. And Kant associates image with images when he claims the concept of number equally requires pure sensible images. One can thus understand the pure intuitions of space and time as sketch paths given to the mind on which we draw image of certain shapes and numbers. Such an activity of drawing exhibits features of space that the pure intuition alone does not exhibit. To bring this discussion to a close, we should hold apart three different things that are not equivalent for Kant: space itself, parts of space, or the manifolds of space, and objects in space. One way to understand Kant's claim that it is consistent with the no intuitions thesis is that the imagination produces neither space nor the manifold of spaces. The senses, not the imagination, produce the pure intuition of space and provide the manifold of spaces. Though this is not the final word on pure intuition Kant, I hope this model clarifies what... see, now we've got the model talk right there. I hope this model clarifies what opponents of the no intuition thesis need to argue. The no intuitions thesis allows that the imagination is required to represent determinate objects in space, objects like squares and triangles. But the no intuition thesis denies both A, that essential features of the pure intuitions of space depend on the imagination, and B, that the imagination produces the manifold of spaces. As I argued in section 3, facts about image production seem ill-equipped for challenging no intuitions thesis on the ground on either of these points, so appealing to the image production procedures of the imagination in such an argument is not a promising strategy for challenging the no intuitions thesis. Okay, back to almost done. Conclusion. This essay argued that, I remember starting essays like this, argued for stuff like back in high school. Gotta think of something new. This essay argued that for Kant, the imagination generates images in the image thesis, and that these images are fundamentally distinct from empirical and pure intuitions. The distinctness thesis. Moreover, these theses complement the claim that the imagination does not generate intuitions at all, no intuitions thesis. As I noted in the introduction, a full defense of the no intuitions thesis would need to incorporate an account of the transcendental deduction, since many interpreters find this section of the first critique the strongest philosophical considerations for thinking that the imagination must actually produce intuitions, usually because they think the understanding plays a role in the generation of intuition. Nevertheless, section 2.3 provided a sketch of the imagination's determination function that serves as a starting point for an account of the transcendental deduction friendly to the image thesis, distinctness thesis, and no intuitions thesis. The image thesis and distinctness thesis raise several questions for further investigation, and I'll note 3. First, there is... okay, we're at the bottom. First, there is the general question of what the different functions of images and intuitions are in cognition of various kinds. Broadly speaking, intuitions and the senses figure into the explanation of how finite subjects can be related to objects in the first place, whereas images in the imagination figure into the explanation of how intuited objects can be determined and ultimately related to concepts. But the precise sense in which a particular cognition depends on actual image formation remains an open question. Of course, this sort of image thing is very abstract. How do you map anything from the world into some sort of map, and then from the map to a concept? If you want to use a map to get from point A to point B, there's infinite ways. The map, how you read the map, all the stuff. So it's these things are... it's a reasonable idea that you get a map from the world, but 20th century philosophy right there. A lot of phenomenology and other stuff. But the precise sense of particular cognition depends on actual images remains an open question. Second and related, more work is required to determine how schemata relate differently to images on the one hand and intuitions on the other. Given the diversity among schemata, it is possible that some schemata depend on images or intuitions, while some images depend on schemata. Sure, I don't even know what a schemata is. Finally, there remains the question of how precisely images depend on consciousness or vice versa. Similarly, there remains the question of how precisely images depend on concepts or vice versa. And again, given the diversity of empirical, mathematical, and philosophical concepts that Kant invokes, it is possible that there will be no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. However these questions play out, the present essay provided a clear... don't say yourself is clear. I mean, you're right, it was kind of clear. I mean, kudos to the author here, R. Brian Tracz. But, yeah, it just seems sort of weaselly to say that you did something clearly. That's not for you to judge. Even though it was clear, you're right. The present provided a clear conception of the contribution that the imagined, as distinct from the senses, makes to sensibility. The contribution of sensibility to human cognition relies on a complex interweaving of both sense and imagination, and adequately understanding this relationship requires us to take into account Kant's theory of images. Okay, do I know any of these people? No, why would I know any Kantians? Okay. Yep, not a bad essay. I'm sure if you're Kantian, this would mean more to you. What's kind of fun is, I don't know if you guys can see the header on this. It says Tracz, ergo writing sample is the name of the file. So it's like writing sample. I mean, was this the sample they sent out for like a job? Why is it a writing sample? It's really a very nice exposition. It looks like it makes a nice claim by saying that there's an extra concept in between, well, not concept, an extra spot between intuition and concept in Kant. So I hope this person gets a job or something with this. Yeah, who knows. Okay, thanks for watching if you're still with me, and hope to see you next time. Bye.